Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Rose Report. Tonight I'm joined by Zach Miller, who's a young conservative commentator. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had you on a couple years ago to talk about the youth vote and really what the future was. And since then, we've had two elections. I believe we've had the 2020 election, the 2022 midterms. And what we've learned from both of them is that our predictions sort of about the youth vote turned out to be right. So I just wanted to get your first opinion on the youth vote and youth outreach in this last midterm election where there was not a red wave.
Yeah, I think that we have two things going on right now. Republicans are, on the one hand, struggling to reach out to young people, and on the other hand, the people that I think conventional political wisdom would say would do better at reaching out to young people, Ron DeSantis and people like that, are actually not favored. There was a poll by younger Republicans. So there's a poll that I saw today where basically, young Republicans prefer Donald Trump by a pretty large margin to Ron DeSantis, and the DeSantis supporters to the older Republicans. So we kind of have a weird dichotomy there that's going to be difficult for conservatives to deal with.
It is, and it's interesting because a lot of people would say, well, we're sort of in the post-Trump era. A lot of young conservatives are supposed to be sick of Donald Trump. And yet when you look at the vote, the number breakdown, and you go talk to young conservatives, those who are not solely in the Bush camp, those who have a little bit more leeway, they tend to be for Donald Trump. So why is it where we're standing post the midterms, we're still seeing so many young people in the Republican Party break solidly for Trump, even when a lot of his candidates didn't win in this election cycle?
I think it's difficult to say, but probably we have to look at the different worlds that young people grew up in versus, older Republicans. Older Republicans grew up in a country where, people agreed on most things. So, a Republican and a Democrat, they might disagree on, how to get somewhere, but they generally agreed on where they wanted to go. Whereas young people grew up in a world where conservatives and progressives, they don't even agree on the destination, much less how to get there. And so I think that that's why you're seeing young Republicans really want to just throw grenades into the system. Young Republicans are getting behind J.D. Vance, they're getting behind Blake Masters, and they're getting behind Donald Trump. And when they see Ron DeSantis, who I think a lot of young Republicans like, but they're apprehensive because Donald Trump is the person who really kind of kicked this off and kind of gave young Republicans and these sort of more reactionary figures space to get into the Republican Party. But also, when they see organizations like National Review lining up behind Ron DeSantis, they get very apprehensive and they start to think, well, maybe we're wrong about this guy. I'm not saying they are, but I do think that that's why there's a bit of apprehension. I think that's why there's a lot of loyalty to Trump among that crowd.
And there basically seems to be this embedded trust in Trump not being a rhino and not being an establishment figure. That's really hard for someone like Ron DeSantis, who may align with Trump on the majority of policies, to overcome. And so one of the things I've looked at is how do other candidates build that level of trust with young people? And I think, unfortunately, at this junction, there isn't enough time to do so on the Republican side. So for a Republican candidate like Ron DeSantis, is there a future in getting the 2024 presidential nomination on the Republican side, or is it just sort of a foregone conclusion because Trump has this embedded trust that's built in with these certain areas of voting base in the Republican Party?
I think if we look at it mathematically, Trump has this, unless he does something crazy, which is always possible, but I think he has this locked up because look, there's probably 30 to 35% of voters who were going to vote for him no matter what happens. And we're going to have no fewer than 10 people running for the Republican nomination. You can rattle off the list of people who have no shot, but the fact is, they're going to take up at least some percentage of the vote. And so DeSantis is going to be fighting for votes with, 8, 9, 10 other people, whereas Trump can kind of just sit there and deal with what he has. He doesn't even need to make inroads. If he does, then great, that opens up his lead, but he doesn't have to. So I think just from a practical side, I wouldn't want to be running against Donald Trump in 2024. However, if they're going to do it, I think they need to sell what they've done. Very few have done anything. Ron DeSantis has. That's something he has going for him. He's done a lot of great stuff. But the problem is, and we've seen come out just today, there's one of his biggest accomplishments was sticking it to Disney. And people thought finally we have another conservative that isn't Donald Trump, who's really going to stick it to these corporations. But now it looks like Florida is going to be giving them back their special district. Now we'll see what ends up happening with that, if they do, or if they, make some deal that's good for conservatives. But I think that Ron DeSantis runs the risk of coming across as someone who is willing to do things for great press, and he's willing to do things right up until things get really hard, right up until you're on the precipice of victory, then you kind of give in. And the reason why people are going to be very apt to think he's like that is because that's what every Republican has always
Right.
been for the last 20, 30 years. Trump wasn't that. For all his flaws, and there are many, he definitely didn't give in. I mean, he's willing to fight just about anyone. And I think that young Republicans specifically are willing to just sort of roll the dice with him again because there's no one else out there that they know isn't going to, I mean, I don't want to say, I think this is sort of a strong word, but betray them once they get into office, if that makes sense.
It does, and I think that's an interesting point about Ron DeSantis, because he does have this way of being where he'll do something giant, like the Martha's Vineyard incident, and he'll push out that he's going to be, a great conservative warrior, but then he won't talk for a long time about Trump's home being raided in Mar-a-Lago, for example. Like he delays his reactions to things. And I've wondered, because you mentioned the National Review, these organizations that are backing Ron DeSantis that really don't like Trump, if you look at him on a policy level, a lot of them don't align with Ron DeSantis. A lot of them are much more neocon, they're much more rhino than Ron DeSantis is. Do you see that becoming a problem if we go forward in a presidential nomination process where Ron DeSantis's policies being so different from the establishment policies, there begins to be conflict there, even though the establishment wants him way more than they want Trump?
I think it could be. I mean, so DeSantis has a great talent that very few other politicians have. The only politician I'm really aware of that has it in the country, although Republican, is Brian Kemp. He's able to appear as a moderate while being very conservative. Brian Kemp does well in Georgia because a lot of Georgians kind of think he's moderate. He's not, but he's able to sell himself that way. Ron DeSantis is the same thing. You run into an issue in a national Republican primary for president when that's your brand.
Yeah.
Now, if Republicans know that's what you're doing, if everyone's on board with that, that's fine. But when you have a former Republican president coming after you, saying that you're a liar, saying that you're not who you say you are, saying this guy is selling, he's a snake oil salesman, which is what Trump's going to do.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't blame him for doing that. I mean, Trump wants to be president again, and he's going to say whatever he has to say. And Trump is smart enough to know that if he sows doubt in DeSantis, a lot of people are going to be very apprehensive. People who might be interested in moving on from Trump. They might at least be open to it. But I think what's going to end up happening is unless DeSantis can figure out a way to really hammer home that he's the guy, that he can be trusted, which, again, like you said, I don't know how he does that. There are very few ways this close to 2024. I think people are just kind of going to fall back into Trump.
And that idea of falling back into Trump is very real. And I don't think a lot of older conservatives understand. A lot of young conservatives may feel they have no choice but to fall back into him because they view him as being at least a safe option. And one of the things I've wondered about is how do you reconcile, in terms of outreach and strategy, the fact that so many young conservatives by a margin are going to go for Trump, whereas on the national scale, like in the U.S. House of Representatives in the 2022 midterms, it was 63% to 35% for Democrats because so many young people don't like Trump. They don't like his candidates. Where is that middle ground of picking Trump because young people in the conservative world like him, but young people in the independent and Democrat world don't like him? How do you do that, do you think?
I don't think there's anything you can really do to convince people to vote for Donald Trump who are very turned off by him at this point. What Trump should do is not really, I don't want to say not campaign, but I think he needs to just run a very simple campaign on, look, when I was in office, everyone had a lot of money. They were doing very well. Life was easier. Sure, you heard a lot of stuff from the media, but that was just all noise. Your life was better. Your life now is not good. You go to the grocery store, you have to put things back. Maybe you're struggling to pay rent. Maybe you've missed some payments on your credit cards because you had to make tough decisions one month. That's the kind of campaign that Trump could win. And the fact is, Trump's path to victory is a lot narrower than someone like Ron DeSantis.
Right.
When it comes to House races and Senate races, I do think that Trump probably needs to stay out of them in most cases. He needs to focus his energy on states that love him, states like West Virginia, states like Ohio. That's where he needs to be because he can make sure that we put the right person through the primary. and then obviously that person will win the general. But he needs to stay out of states like Georgia. He probably needs to avoid Texas. He probably needs to avoid Florida. I mean, well, maybe not Florida, but you get what I'm saying. I mean, he needs to sort of direct his energy where it's best used, and we need to be very strategic as a party about how to do this. But of course, our party infrastructure has shown that they can't do that. So I'm not sure really what 2024 is going to look like. It's very interesting. We don't have very much talent, to be completely honest. We have Trump, who has great instincts, who can run a great campaign. He's shown that he can do it, but you know, he's not really hiring the people, or at least we don't have the people in the RNC. We don't have the people running these campaigns, choosing these candidates who have shown that they understand how to reach out to voters, and that's going to be a problem.
And you mentioned the RNC and reaching out to voters. And one thing I've wondered is the Rust Belt, which used to be an area that Trump was, succeeding so much in. He flips Michigan in 2016. There seems to be enough people there for him to continuously have rallies throughout the Rust Belt. We look at the Rust Belt now, and we've lost significant ground. I mean, the Michigan governor's race, it's sort of become, in my mind, Michigan's become an example of where the Republican Party is losing ground. And I wonder, how do you reach out to young voters, or how do you even begin the process in an area like Michigan, where at the University of Michigan, 94% of young people there voted for Gretchen Whitmer, compared with 6% for Tudor Dixon. So what is that process in a state like Michigan that Trump used to have such an advantage in?
I think that the Republican Party is uniquely terrible at choosing candidates.
Yeah.
And this isn't a Donald Trump thing. I mean, people get on to Trump about choosing, Dr. Oz and people like that. And you can criticize Trump all day for candidate quality, but the thing is, the Republican Party is no better. We do this thing, especially do it in Michigan. We choose people who we look and we see, okay, there's a black senator in Georgia, so we're going to nominate a black person because we think we're going to cancel out that advantage. There's a female governor in Michigan, we have to nominate a female. That's the way that the Republican Party thinks, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, demographic groups aren't going to just vote for someone because they look like them. There are much deeper reasons why they're voting for Democrats at a larger margins than they are Republicans. And so I think we really need to look at who is voting for us in the Rust Belt. White working class men who did not go to college. You need to nominate people who can speak to them. You need to nominate, quite frankly, like the fact that the Republican Party is afraid of nominating white men is ridiculous. And I know that there are going to be people who listen to this and they're going to think, well, they're not afraid of nominating white men. We do it all the time. Yes, but go and look at why people said Tudor Dixon was a great candidate. They said she was a great candidate because she could go right at Gretchen Whitmer, and she's a real strong woman and all.
Yeah.
But people were voting for Gretchen Whitmer, they're not thinking that way. And it's obvious they're not thinking that way because someone who, frankly, treated Michigan voters horribly and who has not been an effective governor, won by very large margins.
Right.
To someone who the Republican Party told us was a great candidate. And so, and Trump, to his, it's his fault too. He also got behind some of these candidates. We need to stop playing the demographic game where we try to nominate people because we think they're going to check boxes. We need to nominate candidates who can speak directly to the voters who are going to support us. And then we can expand the coalition. But we need to start with white working class men. Ryan Gradusky does this really well. He talks about how if you were able to get white working class voters to turn out and vote for Republicans in the same way that Democrats are able to get black voters to turn out and vote for them, the Rust Belt wouldn't even be competitive. Right. I mean, Trump would have won in 2020 if he had gotten the same margins among those voters that he did in 2016. That's what you need to focus on. So we're really missing the forest for the trees, trying to make this, multiracial working class party. That's a fine goal, and it's something we should strive for. But in the short term, we need to focus on the voters who are actually willing to vote for us and nominate candidates who can actually reach them.
And Democrats have learned this lesson with the Hispanic community. They've learned to not just nominate people who are Hispanic, because that does not guarantee you all of that voting block. And they've talked about that extensively. Van Jones has tried to explain to the DNC that that's not the way forward. And I'm glad you mentioned this sort of tit for tat nomination system we have on the GOP side. The idea that Tudor Dixon would be a great candidate simply because she could say things that maybe a male nominee couldn't to Gretchen Whitmer, that doesn't really track. It doesn't make any sense. And we had this process, the same thing with John James a couple election cycles ago. We tried this again. And I'm wondering, we've had a lot of conversations on Twitter, I think, in the conservative world and then Fox News about the future of Ronna McDaniel as RNC chair. And the idea that she's running for another term, and she thinks that she has this program to push forward. There's a new advisory council to discuss what went wrong this election cycle. What in your mind is the biggest weakness of the RNC? Because to me, it seems like we just don't have a leadership team that's cognizant of what the grassroots wants and what voters want. But in your mind, what is the biggest weakness in the RNC right now?
The biggest weakness is they have no idea what they're doing. I
Yeah.
mean, we have people out there who have shown that they know how to win elections. So Lee Zeldin, I understand why people wouldn't want to nominate someone like Lee Zeldin. It makes perfect sense. Why would you have someone, or have him as the head of the RNC who's from New York when you don't need New York to win the
Right.
presidency? But that's not the point. The point is that he was able to go to people who, quite frankly, don't like him very much. They're certainly not predisposed to liking him very much, and he was able to convince them, listen, I get that, but give me a chance. He was able to talk to these people who, frankly, had no business voting for him. And he came really, really close to becoming the next governor of New York. Ronna McDaniel, meanwhile, lost 2018, she lost 2020, and she lost 2022.
Yeah.
And you can blame that on Trump all you like, but the fact is, she was the head of the RNC, and Trump was not involved in 2022. Now, he was out here not endorsing people and things like that, but you have to run a party like a machine. And she has shown that she can't do it. The RNC needs to run more like the DNC. It needs to have a machine. Look, the DNC right now, they're moving the first stop on the presidential nomination to South Carolina. Why are they doing that? Because they want to control who is able to get the nomination. They do not want to run the risk of nominating a crackpot. They don't want to nominate some lunatic who they know can't win. And so the RNC is terrified of doing that. They're terrified of getting in a back room and saying, listen, no, this is who we need, and we're all going to get behind him. It's the same thing that Republicans have, it's the same problem they have in the Senate. And this is what depresses turnout, because voters get really upset about it. How in the world do you lose a vote from a senator in Wyoming and West Virginia on enshrining same-sex marriage into U.S. law? How is that possible? Is there any scenario where Democrats would lose a vote from Oregon?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, it's not going to happen. And so Republicans are very, very, very weak. They lose votes all the time. This is the problem. If they want to make an advisory council, that's fine. They need to have someone on there, and maybe they do. Blake Masters is going to be on there from what I've seen, so that's good. They need to have someone on there that tells them that they're horrible at this, and that quite frankly, they need to start from scratch. They need to figure out what voters want. They have no idea what voters want. B, they need to nominate the people who can actually take that message to them, people who are from those communities, people who actually understand what they want to hear, and quite frankly, what they're struggling with. And C, they need to actually get out and do the work. They're not willing to do all three. So I'm not very optimistic about 2024 if we have this same leadership team going in there.
And I'm glad you said that, because I'm not optimistic about 2024 either. And there's this sort of idea that it's a foregone conclusion that we'll win in 2024 because of how weak Biden is. But it was supposed to be a foregone conclusion there'd be a red wave because of how weak Biden is. And you mentioned the fact that the DNC is sort of realigning its primary to ensure that they don't have somebody in the AOC model come in and take that nomination, because it's certainly possible in the nomination process to lose it to a complete socialist and someone so on the left they know they couldn't campaign nationally and win. So just sort of in closing, when you look at the leadership of the RNC and you look at the fact that there seems to be this almost MAGA establishment now that's running everything and directing who gets endorsements, do you see a pathway forward for the grassroots to take control? Or are we at a point now where the elitism in the RNC is sort of suppressing that?
Well, there's always a path for the grassroots to take control. I mean, we've seen that. We saw it in 2010, and 2014, and in 2016. But I think that we have a lot steeper hill to climb now, because we got Trump in, and then Trump put these people in, and so it's a difficult path for someone to come in and say, well, we need to take them out, because then ultimately, if we're going to do that, it needs to be Trump who does it. And in order for that to happen, Trump needs to get the nomination. So either essentially Trump gets the nomination and he decides that we're going to start from ground zero, or someone like DeSantis gets the nomination and he decides to completely clean house. I'm not sure if either one of them would. I think DeSantis would be more likely to. But the problem for Trump is that he really likes people who like him.
Mhm.
And I understand why that's become a thing. I mean, I can only imagine what I would do if I was constantly under attack the way that he is. But there's a limited amount that we can do. What I would recommend for people is get plugged in your state, your city, and do what you can. I mean, the Florida GOP has done a great job. The Georgia GOP has done a fairly good job. The Texas Republican Party certainly is very different than what you would find in most places in the country. You can change your local and state GOP. There's not much you can do yelling on Twitter about the national GOP.
Right.
That is in the hands of power players that, if you want to be one of those, you have to start locally. So um, I think that people should just do what they can where they are, and they should make sure to get out and vote. And that's really all that we can do, unfortunately.
And also people have to remember, we don't really know who Ron DeSantis's people are yet. I mean, we know who his people in government are, people who have official positions, his lieutenant governor, but we're not really sure yet what that network of people is going to be like when you have someone in a presidential process. When you run for president, everything comes out and everything happens. So we may find out even that those people maybe even need to be gutted. Thank you for coming on. Where can people follow you on social media to keep up with your commentary?
Yeah, you on Twitter @_ Zachary Miller. You can follow me there. That's pretty much where I post everything.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.